Okay, please. And I am preparing everything to get ready, and yay. Whee. Whee. Oh, wee. Hello. Yeah. I live. And as such, I am prepared and waiting for people to show up. Merry Christmas, Merry Christmas, Happy Christmas, yay. Yeah, whatever holiday you follow, I don't care. There's no such thing as a war on Christmas. There's no such thing as... No. I myself don't say, you can't say Merry Christmas. And hello, Emilio! I am going to... You know, I used to know someone named Micheletti. He passed away in my 9th grade year. Anyway, I am going to be doing yet another just random chatty show tonight as part of the whole Christmas thing. And one of the things is I'm going to make suggestions on how, easiest way to paint FDM using this as a sample. I'm not actually going to paint it. I'm just going to use it as a diagram. Point to different areas. Actually, this is too thick. Let's use this. Yeah, there we go. I can point out things there like that. Yeah. Okay. But of course, that's going to wait till we have more than just the two of us in here. For those who are watching the replay on YouTube, the usual like, subscribe, bell icon. Yay, join me. I've got 237 people following me at this moment. 13 away from 250. Also, sponsored by Anycubic. Yay. You might not have heard. I had a race last night, overnight. The CR10 won the race with this version of the figure. The Photon with the many-eyed Argus version without the helmet and with a crook instead of the spear didn't win. But it's a whole lot nicer figure. The problem is I forgot to top off the vat before I printed the base on the Photon. So it came out nicely. I mean, you can see the texture pattern there and the footprints where he rests. But he didn't quite finish. I've got about 90% of the base here. Shwee! Okay, so I guess the first thing that we're going to talk about tonight is, like I said, how I would suggest someone who's not very experienced, just hasn't done painting very much or rarely paints, to deal with an FDM print. I mean, case in point, I'm going to pull up... No, not that one. Well... No, not him. Him, yeah. This is an orc printed on my CR10. He looks pretty good. He's very clearly recognizable. But as we zoom in, you'll see that he's not perfect. I've seen much better come off of a lot of people's Ender 2s. Or Ender 3s, rather. Let me pull that back a bit. Now this means that there's a lot of layer lines that are visible when you go to use standard painting techniques. This is a problem. So if you're going to paint an FDM printed mini, here's how I would suggest handling it. And for the most part, it works like this. And you do this for almost every area of the figure. You would just change what colors and what types of paints you use depending on that area. Alright, so let's say we're going to paint this orc. I'm using this as a giant version just to show you. Yeah. Well, we'd start off with a significantly dark version of the shade. In this case, well, let's say this angel green. It's a really dark, it's about the same green as Dark Angel Green from Games Workshop. It's a really dark, almost a dark olive, but because it's not fully saturated, it's not like a dark emerald green. Okay, that is where you would put your you just paint the whole area. In this case, his skin, all of it that color. Then you'd go for all of the areas that are raised, and you would just directly paint on, all of these different little areas. Paint on a medium shade. In this case, something like this, which this is army green which is pretty much what I consider to be a default base skin tone for orcs the way I do them. And then on the highest points, like on the brow, tip of the cheek, tip of the nose, tip of the lips, tip of the ears, you'd use an even lighter shade, which in this case would be scaly hide, which is almost like taking that army green and mixing it with white. And hello, Eledrian. I'm assuming I'm pronouncing that correct, isn't it? Eledrian? Anyway, that's just a very basic rundown. Yes, happy holidays. Hello, William. Any, whatever holiday you follow, enjoy it and good on you. If you don't have a holiday, cool beans. Now, basically that's just the basics on how I would do it. A dark, then just paint on the medium shade, and then touch up highlights on the small spots. For tabletop purposes, just sitting back, you'd probably either be painting an existing miniature, or you'd be painting on resin. I'm going to put this guy up here. Yeah, because I need space over there. But I mean, like, perfect example if you want to do that with metal. Well, I have a black steel here. It's in the Model Air line from Vallejo. Black metallic. I'd then give it a medium metallic, like this gunmetal. And then on the very tips and edges, really bright silver. With metallics, you need to almost have a more extreme difference. For example, this is Tinny Tin game color. Games Workshop used to have a color called Tin Bits that was very similar to this. It's a very, very dark brown metallic, almost like... Well, if you look carefully at bronze, yes, there's the green that forms as a patina, but there's also a blackish color. That forms very similar color to that. Then you'd put on a medium color, which could be either copper or bronze, depending on what you're trying to get to. And then highlight with the gold. It's really, really simple. Inks. I do not recommend any form of ink or wash on an FDM print, because it just accents the layer lines and make it screams out, "I was printed on a 3D printer," and it kind of breaks the illusion. It gets rid of the whole. Over here, I've got a couple of these that I painted as a little bit more oomph. There you go, and pull up the focus. This is my Orc Sergeant. And yes, this is printed on my CR10. You can kind of tell by the erratic nature of the sword, and if you look carefully at the back of it, let me pull up closely, you can see that it has layer lines. Oh, come on. Which does also advertises that I printed it upright. But that was effectively done the same way. It just more layers in between. When it comes to resin prints, like these guys, you can use more traditional techniques, because in many cases the resolution on a resin print is about the same as the size of some paint's pigment grains. Anyway, so I actually have people watching tonight. So, is there any Q&A that any of you would like? Any questions you have about sculpting or posing or where to get ideas or anything like that? Oh, real quick, going back to that. For yellows and reds, you really need to use multiple layers because they are translucent. The best yellows and reds, no matter how opaque, there's very few truly opaque yellows and reds. Anyway, any questions, suggestions, or places that you're stuck in your own sculpting? Any ideas for how to handle a given texture or anything like that? Oh, excuse me. Oh, look at this little baby girl. She's a little sweet kitty. Okay, you just got started sculpting in Blender. Okay, I can't help with Blender. The last time I tried Blender was in the early 2000s. And the UI back then was... Someone took a book on UI design and laid each page up on a target and then loaded a shotgun with bird shot. And okay, we're going to use that and that and that. It's gotten a lot better since then, I understand, but it was so strange. And because users were making the plugins and the functionality, they'd put almost identical things in absolutely different areas. Is this a modifier? Is this a new object? Is this a space warp? Yeah. I don't think they'll match ZBrush simply for the sake of the ungodly amount of polygons and speed that ZBrush can deal with. Blender might be more effective than Maya's sculpting tools. I don't think they're going to match ZBrush. Well, William, there is a trial version, a 1-month trial version of ZBrush, so you can find out if it will stick. You just got to remember that it does not have ZModeler. It doesn't have the texturing tools. The rest that I use, it has. Core, that is. Core does not have the ZModeler or the texturing tools. And it also has a smaller polygon limit, but I've almost never gotten to that polygon limit, to the core level, let alone the full version. Okay, to start making sculpture, there's really nothing missing from core that I couldn't live without, simply because, at least for sculpting. Most of what's missing from core is stuff that would be more effective for me on texturing and dealing with baking maps and things like that for rendering, as opposed to sculpting for print. If I did not have 3D Studio Max, then ZModeler would be my number 2 modeling program. But I've got a polygon modeler. I've got Rhino 3D, which is a NURBS modeler. I don't need ZModeler. Okay. How to start making sculpture. The first thing is you've got to have geometry to start with. Some people will start just by drawing a sphere in ZBrush and start pulling it out and getting it all set up from there. I don't like that. It's just a personal thing. I'd rather start with existing geometry. And there is a tutorial, a very famous tutorial called the Joan of Arc tutorial. I've seen it rewritten. It was originally written, if I remember correctly, for Maya. And then it was translated for Blender, 3D Studio Max, and all sorts of other modeling programs. It is how to model a human being. It's a cartoony human being, but the proportions we make for printing are pretty cartoony. Follow that tutorial. Then go back and, using what you learned from the tutorial, make your own geo, make your own figure. And then you do what's called rigging. Exactly, William. Rigging is basically setting imaginary bones inside the figure. Let me go ahead and pull up that studio and I'll show you what I'm talking about. Rigging is that. The look for these bones, where it's two intersecting diamonds with a circle where near the back end. That's actually I've seen that in 3D Studio Max. I've seen it in Maya. It's a common depiction. And basically what it is the short end is the pivot point. I mean, you can see how it's bending around that green dot. And then the next thing that's happened is you have what are called maps. In the case of DAZ Studio, you have one for each axis if you choose. Where it is bright red, it is entirely only doing that. It's only on that bone. Now if I then go down from the collar to the shoulder, you'll see that it's a brighter red down here. And then from the shoulder to the forearm, it's down there. Where it's blue, it's got a smaller blends from bright red through purple. You have less and less interaction. Just to show you what would look like, let's go ahead, go back to Tool Settings, Geometry Select and Select All, Weight Editing, Fill by Bone Selection Groups. Wait, Weight Editing, Fill by Bone Selection Groups. Okay, there you go. See, this is what it looks like if you don't blend them. Now when I then go ahead and bend it, you see what's happening there? Also, let me go ahead and, I've got it right now set to have a subdivision, yeah. But yeah, as I move this up and down, I then, it has a problem. So by smoothing it, let me go ahead and delete that because I don't want to save that by accident. If we go ahead and go back and look at that, you can see that there's a very faint affectation around a lot. The affectation is extremely low to the point where I can go to 180 degrees where he's damn near mutated and you won't see any actual change. But that's rigging. Once you've got it rigged, you can pose it, and then from there go on to sculpting on the clothing, the armor, etc. Go ahead and pop back in. It was a tutorial created many years ago to explain how this guy made a kind of an anime-esque salute to the French heroine Jeanne d'Arc, known in English as Joan of Arc. What is your primary program? Do you use Blender? Do you have another program like 3D Studio Max or Lightwave? Although I doubt Lightwave. That's old. That's gone bye-bye. Hexagon. Any of those? Almost. There's a huge number. Yeah, 3dtotal.com has the original. It has been translated for using the techniques and skills of other programs. Let me see, just out of curiosity, Joan of Arc tutorial for 3ds Max. Okay. Yeah, they've got variants. The earliest version that I know of for this, the Joan of Arc tutorial, that was like 2004, maybe? But yeah, it's probably your best option for learning to model a human. For Critter, but it shows you the basics that you need to know. For example, there are concepts. There's a concept called edge loops. Now, the outside of the human eye is not two sharp curves meeting at corners. It's a loop, a single loop that at the corners is pinched. The mouth is the same way. There are certain edge loops that are part of how the muscles work that would correspond to how you would arrange the quads on a mesh. For example, there's an edge loop that comes around the top of the nose, down to the front of the chin, back up, and around. There's edge loops all the way around the eye, edge loops around the mouth, one from the forehead, down in front of the ear, and then down under the chin, and back up. I'm still using 2011 3D Studio Max, mainly because what I used to do is I used to buy 3D Studio Max. I would then use it and save up for a few years, and then buy like I went from the 3D Studio Max 2.5, I think, 3D Studio Max 7, then 3D Studio Max 2011. And then I saved up, and by the time I had enough again, they had gone to the subscription model, and I said, forget that. No. So I'm still using 2011. By the same token, I'm still using Photoshop CS3. Now, I know that some of you have seen this on the various chats. And I showed it off at the beginning, but there's new people in here. Last night, I started a race, or yesterday afternoon, I started a race between my CR10 and my Anycubic Photon on the Argus and generic Storm Giant versions of one of my most recent sculpts for the Kickstarter. The CR10 won. But the Photon just looks so much better. And then I did something stupid. After I removed Argus from the Photon, I started to print his base. Can anyone guess what happened? It was. I'll say this: it was not a problem with the machine. It was a problem with me. No, I didn't print it flat. I always print bases and angle about like that. No. What I did... Where are you going, Fuzzbutt? Oh, you're going to go eat. I forgot to top off the tank. Right about the time it got there, it started printing into air. Thin air. So I got about 90% of the base. Came up great. Looks great. You can see where the feet set in, and it fits like a glove. Yeah. Missing that. So I've got it printing again. Let's add a media file here. There's that. Desktop. Meshes. Render. Argus not only comes with the generic Storm Giant version, he also comes with his dire Cape Buffalo. A regular Cape Buffalo would be the back would be a little bit over shoulder high to the human on the far side. These guys are just a little bit again bigger. Now to him, they may as well be pygmy goats. But they're dire Cape Buffalo. More Cape Buffalo kill hunters, big game hunters every year than lions do. They're bad little moo cows. You don't mess with them. But yes, he's coming with a dire Cape Buffalo. On top of that, each one of the figures has additional figures. I think I've kind of emphasized that. Yeah. So, imagine you're sitting in, whatever kind of major city in your campaign world, and you hear some kind of commotion out near the East Gate. You head out there and you find out what's going on. A 25-foot tall giant with eyes all over his head is demanding justice. That the law give him justice because someone stole one of his cows. And he considers himself a citizen of this duchy, and therefore he demands the Duke's justice. Someone stole from him. And now you got to decide, are you going to go out there and fight this Storm Giant-sized giant who, according to all reports, works directly for the Queen of the Gods and is several thousand years old? Or are you going to go find out who is Billy Badass enough to steal Things like that are going to be included in my set. I'm including 5th edition stat blocks and adventure hooks that don't necessarily involve direct combat with the giants. But yeah, I topped off the resin and I'm reprinting the base. It should be done around midnight tonight Central Time. At which point I'm going to remove it from the bed, make sure I've got enough resin in the tank, and print the Dire Cape Buffalo. Mm-hmm. Oh. Ow! Ow, ow, ow. So any other questions or advice? Suggestions for a future episode? I mean, this is episode 104. I've done over 100 broadcasts. Wow. Hello, Andy! Sorry, I was throwing away the tab. Yes, I take the tabs and I take them off and I put them inside another can. Definitely not the can I'm drinking from. That would be stupid. I saw an episode of Quincy about that when I was like 9. But yeah, we're just doing, whatevers tonight. Question and answer, suggestions, painting suggestions. I can't demonstrate the painting because I'm of the school of set up a little tray table right here between the computer table and the kitty bed, and that's where I do my painting. But no tray table setup. So, poke. Any requests, suggestions, comments? It could be about printing, sculpting, painting, the history of role-playing games, stories about my cats. Come on, Shinji. Yes. You heard me. Get over here. Good girl. This is Shinju. She's about to be 13 in just a couple months. Isn't that right, baby girl? She's also... she's a very snuggly kitty. Yeah, sweetie. Okay, where to start? I was just over that. If you've never done any kind of sculpting before or modeling, the best place to start is a tutorial called Joan of Arc tutorial. I believe it was originally for Maya. It may have been originally for Blender, but it's been translated for most modeling programs. If you mean directly sculpting from nothing, that would actually, the start of it is actually dependent on what you're sculpting in, whether it's ZBrush or Sculptress or Blender, to go from like a ball to a vaguely humanoid shape. ZBrush, for example, has something called Z-spheres. You basically draw out the skeleton, and then you can rotate them and do that and get into a pose. Then you give it a skin, and you've got a basic shape to start sculpting on. What I did was I made my very basic humanoid shape, or human male shape, right here. And I modeled it in 3D Studio Max. And this is not DAZ Studio geometry. This is my own custom geometry. Modeled it in 3D Studio Max, and then rigged it here in this program, which is called DAZ Studio. I did this because DAZ Studio, alright, you can see where the bones are, where the joints are. With DAZ Studio, when I create a blend shape to turn it, for example, into a dwarf, notice how the bones are moving with him. In most other programs, those bones would not move. Which would mean that when I turn into a dwarf, and I do this, it would be all the way up here. But instead, what I get is, I get to make poses that work no matter what shape I give him. I mean, even going down to this kobold, it still works within the figure. The other thing, the reason I chose to do this is because I can then make a library of props, like, say, this Celtic sword right here. This is for the right hand. I click on it. Not only does it jump to the right hand, it closes the hand around it because I set that up when I made it. And now if I go and I bend this elbow, the sword goes with it. It's a matter of, it's how I chose to set up my basic geometry. Oh, Kim and TJ. But when creating your own base geometry, there's a tutorial called the Joan of Arc tutorial. It's on 3D Total, and there's mirrors of it on all sorts of places for all sorts of different other programs, like how you would translate it. There are people who will sculpt from scratch. They'll just load in a sphere and start pulling on it and stretching it and bending it and shaping it from there. And I'm of the mindset that that's reinventing the wheel every time. So, I'm of the mindset, do as much as you can. That's going to be done every time, or so many times. Do as much of it as possible before. Make that base figure. You make your own base figure if you want. And then use that as a standard starting point. I will admit, I used a different base figure. Whoa. For my giants. Yes, this is Argus, many-eyed giant. A very prominent Greek chin. I used a different one, but it's still, I made it using the same techniques. And yes, little fuzzy Basahan, the massive Polyphemus, and tall boy Argus are all from the same base figure. Well, you take care of yourself, you understand me, Kim? You can't stay long, but hey, do you have any questions about how a technique to do? How to handle a given texture or anything like that? Anything? No. Andy, they would have been if they ever existed in the same place, simply because Polyphemus was famous for being impious. He hated the gods. Argus was loyal and dedicated servant of Hera. The end result, in fact, to the point where when he was killed, she was so impressed by his dedication and loyalty that she put his eyes in her favorite bird's tail, the peacock. I can fully understand, Kim. So, when I created game stats for them, Polyphemus was chaotic evil. but Argus was lawful neutral. They would hate each other if they ever met. On the other hand, Argus and the three primary Cyclops, the ones that worked for Hephaestus, would have been allies, because they both were loyal servants of the Dodecatheon. The Dodecatheon being the reference to the 12 most important deities according to the Greeks. Technically, it kind of varied who was in the Dodecatheon depending on the time period that you were looking at. For the most part, it's the six siblings, Hades, Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Demeter, and that whole lot. But yeah, they were both dedicated. They were all the three primary Cyclops and Argus were both dedicated servants of the Dodecatheon, and they probably hung out. I mean, hey. The reason Hera doesn't have many stories like that is because if the Greeks wanted one of the goddesses to do something nice, 9 times out of 10 they had Athena do it. Mostly because most of the writings we have about Greek mythology come from Athens. We have a little bit of pre-Hellenistic writing. We have a little bit from random other spots. But for the most part, the legends and myths that we have are either Roman in origin or they came from Athens. Eledrian, are you on my Discord? Because if so, you can private message me the image on the Discord. Okay, and what exactly are you having... Alright, when you say the basic forms of DAZ, are you talking about the geometry that comes in DAZ Studio? Because 99% of it, number one, has a hard time printing because it's paper thin. Number two, it's not legal to make copies of to 3D print. You can 3D print for personal use only, but you can't distribute or anything. Okay, well there should be a link down here for the Discord, I believe. Yeah, it is. But yeah, it's the problem with most DAZ Studio clothing is it's intended for rendering, not for printing. So instead of having a thickness, I mean, even this has a thickness. It's very thin, but it's probably about right at about a millimeter and a half. It still has a thickness. Clothing in DAZ Studio very often is just a single polygon. They don't need the inside, so they don't have it, so it won't print right. Alright, I see you, Eledrian. Just go ahead and... Oh, by the way, Miniswed, I haven't seen anyone use my voice channel, ever. I don't know if you're actually watching or not. Okay. So we're just waiting on you to send that image so I can give you some advice. But yeah, most of it does not print well at all. Now, there's tricks to make it printable. Case in point, I made a Storm Giant for a tabletop game about 1.5 years ago. Oh. This. But in order to get it to print, the outfit had to be thickened as well, and the hair had to really be played with to print. And even then, it came out completely messy. So yeah, there's problems with trying to 3D print DAS raw DAS files. Yeah, I don't think I've ever seen anyone use my voice chat. Well, there was one time, one of the first Patreon sculpts, I tried to use it and have my patron, be actually talking with me, and the end result was massive slowdown. Okay, you can just, here we go. Alright, yeah, one thing to remember is that 90% of the detail on that robe is texture. It will not show on the print. The trim, the piping, is so small it won't show. And it's paper thin. That will not print. For all intents and purposes, that will not print. It would take a tremendous amount of work to get it to do so. It's number one, the details are all painted on, not actually in the fabric. Number two, the fabric is 1 polygon thick. It has 0 thickness. It is a bent 2-dimensional plane. Number three, it's what detail it does have is too small even for when it does print. It's not going to show up well at all. Let me show you and explain what I'm talking about. Alright. What I'm going to do, this is 3D Studio Max. I'm just using this for an example. Alright, I'm going to make a sphere. We got a ball. Now, I'm going to convert it to polygons. And then I'm going to delete. Let's delete half of it. Now, what you'll see is that it is one-dimensional. It's edge spaces. There is no thickness to this at all. No matter how close we zoom in onto this edge right here, it'll always be just 1 pixel just to mark the edge of it. This is not printable as it is. Let me go ahead and pull this up out of the floor. Now, different programs have different ways to make it printable. For example, with 3D Studio Max, if I wanted to make this printable and still look like a hollow sphere, I can use a shell modifier and then change how thick it gets. See? And now, if I put a smooth modifier, this just tells it, okay, you can see how it looks like it's kind of bent, but in reality it's absolutely flat. Well, we then take the segments and we can tighten those edges. That's one way some programs do it. Another way, let's select that whole outer edge there. To show how we're doing it, let's edge faces again. We have that selected. Let's go ahead and fill the screen with it. And then we come down here to chamfer. Let's make this as minimum as possible, 0.001. Okay, then using this, we select only the border edges, we hit collapse. And what we've just done, now we select this loop, and we're going to chamfer it again. This is another way to give thickness, but it makes it a solid object instead of that hollow shell. Now, I don't know how to do this in most other programs. I do know that this is there's pretty much something similar to it in most programs. And this is what we would end up with after that hollow sphere. But most of that clothing is effectively just tubes with no real thickness. Infinitely thin. As you can see where it crosses over, it's infinitely thin. And then what they would do is they would, for example, let's create shape from selection. And now we got this. Let's make it viewport thickness. There, we've got trim. From the ends, it would look like it has thickness, but that's an illusion. That's just that trim. The actual core, the cylinder itself, is still just a bent two-dimensional plane. There is no thickness here. Okay. Do you see what I'm trying to say about this? Almost everything that comes with DAZ Studio is not printable. Hello, Mark! Oh, I don't have too much left to sculpt before I can start working on starting the Kickstarter. Okay, Andy, the problem is photogrammetry. Number one, it ends up not getting a lot of details that are inset. And if it doesn't do it well. For example, laugh lines. It doesn't really get the laugh lines unless you get just the right angle, and then only for a fraction of it. It also ends up with one heck of a messy looking mesh. It doesn't print well. Let's see. I think the best way to demonstrate this is someone did photogrammetry on some images. Let's see if I can on a miniature from the game Warhammer 40K, and I don't think I can find it. Photogrammetry is good for simple items, but things like sculptures, I will say this. You say you can't sculpt on a PC. I started in 3D. I started sculpting with Milliput, and then went on to green stuff, what's called Kneadetite. And I sculpted miniatures out of Kneadetite using paper clips as skeletons. And then I found out that there's companies out there that have what are called armatures, And it was like, yay, get them armatures. And it went from there. Do I still have that image? I used to have a picture of the armature. No, I don't. Meh. Anyway, the point being, I used to start with that. And I've ended up going on to discovering that ZBrush with a tablet. With one of these. With one of these, and the stylus feels like I'm using my sculpting tools. What I had for tools, I actually had a friend of mine who also sculpted. And what he did, he took 5-6 inch lengths of coat hanger wires to me for Christmas one year. Almost every major miniature company by the time of about 98 to 2000 had their own armatures. And if you were sculpting for them and you were making a human or elven figure, or in some cases also dwarven, halfling, they had one for all the races, you were expected to use their armatures so that your sculpts would end up being the same size and the same proportions as the others in that line from that company. For all intents and purposes, me creating my base mesh is just like creating, this is the armature that all of the meshes in my line will use. So there. But like Games Workshop did that. Ralpartha. Ratham didn't last long enough to do that. But, you know, many, whatever company it was, that P3 used to do that. Now that they have digital sculpting, they don't need to, but they probably have a system in place similar to what I've done. But, yeah. Okay, we're halfway through. Like I said, you can ask questions about sculpting, about the history of tabletop games, about painting, about why I just made decisions that I made. I will say this, whatever you're doing, the more you do it, the better you'll be. Go back on Thingiverse. Look at one of my older sculpts, like the I have a elven sorcerer or something, elven druid. He's got a leafy cape that I cheated with, but it's very simple, very basic looking. You compare that with even something as simple as this guy, and you'll notice this guy, even ignoring the male, he's got a lot more detail than the elf did. He's got the wrinkles in the pants. My brain couldn't do it. The seams above the feet, where the wraps were, and the stitching going down. If you are using a tablet, a lot of the skills are transferable. If you're using a mouse, yay. Oops. No, I don't want that. I've said it before. The difference between using a mouse and using a tablet when sculpting is like the difference between a rattle can and an airbrush. A rattle can can get the job done, but you don't have anywhere near the control or precision that you have with an airbrush. I don't know, Tobias. I've been paying full price. That's why I'm still on 2011. Yeah, there was a miniature available for wood elves back in the 90s. That was pretty much the inspiration. And it's an example of something that's actually slightly easier in putty than in digital sculpting. And what it was, they were called the Way Watchers, and their cloaks and hoods were covered in leaves with a net over top of it, a mesh holding it on. And that's something that would be so much easier with putty, because all you got to do is you roll out putty, make yourself a little stamp in the shape of a leaf, and pop, 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 peel them off, put them on the back of the cloak, then take like I said, a very thin rod and roll it down to make the lines of where the ropes would be, and then lay those ropes down. Mm-hmm. That's an example of something that I really can do much better now. Mostly because it's I've done it. I've been doing this type of sculpting. I know what details will carry over. I know what details really should be present and will print well, both on FDM and on resin. That's my biggest problem back then, was judging how far should I go. I'm printing on a CR10 on an FDM printer. I'm printing miniatures this big on a printer this big. How much detail actually shows? What should I do? Now, not only am I getting better at it, I'm finding other shortcuts that, I'll admit, I got a little bit lazy back in the day with my other job, because textures hide many sins. Don't want to add in the trim on the armor? Put it in the texture with a displacement map that puts the groove around the edge of it. Excuse me. I will also say about tablets, get a Wacom. If for anything more than their reliability and their customer service. About a year and a half ago, I had my old Wacom die on me. By old, I mean it was 9 years old. It was so long out of... it can be, Mark, but some of these people with these enders are coming out, are printing some remarkable level of detail, even with the default nozzle. Anyway, this was a 9-year-old tablet, and it died. So I contacted Wacom, and they said, well, what model is it? And I said, it's an Intuos 3. They sat there with me on the phone for almost an hour trying to figure out what was wrong with it. And once they figured it out, it was the piece that actually connects to the USB cord on the inside of the tablet. They actually went back and tried to find that part in the warehouse to send to me. This is a tablet that had served me. It was. Well, by the time it was all said and done, they didn't have the part. It hadn't been made for almost the past 3 years. So it was time to... But the fact that they were willing to sit with me on a product that had not been supported in just under half a decade, and even try to find parts for it, that's some pretty good customer service. But yeah, so my loyalty for tablets is with Wacom. First of all, they're one of the oldest companies that make the graphics tablet. Second of all, they are dedicated to art. If you walked into... They're the industry standard. If you walked into, say, Pixar's office, and you looked on the desks of the artists, heck, not even just the artists, on some of just the regular people, you'd find Wacom tablets. That's like, there's a reason why the RenderMan rendering engine is used from movies from going all the way back to Star Trek II through today. Yes, the Genesis effect in, not Star Trek 2, Star Trek 3. Yeah, the Genesis effect in Star Trek 3. No, Star Trek 2. Yeah, Star Trek 2. Okay. Star Trek 2, the Genesis effect. Star Trek 3 was just as an example, Avengers Endgame coming up. It's used in Toy Story 4 coming up. RenderMan is good. But when you've been doing something for nigh on 35, 40 years, you probably know a thing or two. And when you are one of the first companies to do something and you're still doing it, you probably know something. I got a pebble in my shoe. I might tread. Now, I jokingly said, ask me about the history of role-playing. One of my original ideas for having a channel, just throwing ideas around, was to actually have one that was about gaming in general. Not, what's the best feat in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons? That's pretty narrow focus there. But more about how do games work? How are they designed? What are the basic styles of gameplay? And I don't just mean, role player, real man, Munchkin, and Looney. I mean, like, is it more of a simulation style rule set? Is it more cinematic? That kind of thing. And I was going to call myself the Polygamist. Now, write down Polygamist as one word. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and do it. Yeah, intentionally a joke. So, I actually went and started doing research on the subject. Did you know that H.G. Wells created a tabletop war game? Excuse me. But yeah, I mean, if you look at rule sets from starting with first edition D&D all the way through the current, you can see D&D swerving and veering between simulationist, cinematic, and even then what it's simulating isn't really reality, but a specific subgenre of fantasy. Bansian magic and all that. Oh. You gotta wonder how your typical role-playing game would be if they had made different decisions in the process of creating Dungeons and Dragons. For example, what if armor didn't make you harder to hit, but made you take less damage? What if, instead of using Vancian magic, where you have a certain number of spell slots per day, and then, You have different levels of spell that take different slots. If they had used a points buy system, a mana system, like, yeah, I can spend 6 mana to cast Fireball, or I can spend that 6 mana to cast 6 Firebolts in the course of 6 rounds, or I can spend all my mana into 1 Fireball. Oh. Ow. Oh no, I'm being attacked, but I just spent all my mana. I'll spend some hit points to get that shield up. How would D&D have been different? Or what if they had, instead of having explicit spells like that, had a list of effects, and you could apply advantages and drawbacks to make your own spells? Like, he has an energy blast that does 66, and so does he. However, his requires a small stone about between 1 to 7 pounds, but also has twice the normal range because it's actually catapulting that stone, whereas he has no range, but it does an auto fire attack because his is electrocution. Oh, that's okay. I'm just saying, how would the evolution of other games around D&D have been? And Mark, they did it with PPE, Potential Psychic Energy, Magic Energy. They did a mana-based system, but you couldn't pump anything, and the more powerful spells required so much PPE, you'd never cast them no matter what level you are. You'd have to have like 15 magic items to give additional mana, and it's just ridiculous the amount of mana some of those spells cost, and the end result was that you were actually still more efficient to do it up close and personal with a sword. D&D has a problem of linear warriors, quadratic wizards. You put a 20th level warrior against a 5th level warrior, a fighter, in 5th ed D&D. And you say the first one to take 20 hit points off the other guy wins. It's almost going to be a toss-up. You put a 20th level wizard against a 5th level wizard, and you say the same thing. Well, if the 20th level wizard gets initiative, it's not gonna be 20 hit points he does. It's going to be 20d6 concussion and 20d6 fire with a meteor swarm. Yeah. So, it's got a problem. At first level, it's actually pretty balanced. First, low levels, and eventually the warrior goes up kind of evenly. The wizard starts a little bit weaker, and then sometime around 7th or 8th level, whoosh, disintegrate, wish, meteor swarm, imprisonment, time stop. Yeah. What gets me is they named PPE before they decided on how to handle psionics. So potential psychic energy is not used for psionics. Psionics use inner strength points. But magic uses potential psionic energy, or potential psychic energy. See, there's one thing D&D does far better than Palladium, and that's giving equal weight to stats. Andy, there is a new edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay coming out. It is supposedly going to be a throwback to the original edition, with, balance with a balance pass. What are you doing, baby girl? Anyway. Yeah. But like I said, in Palladium, physical prowess was God. Because your chances to hit or avoid being hit in melee or ranged was based on your physical prowess. There's really, I mean, it was very unbalanced towards that, towards your physical endurance, especially if you were a mage. And yeah, there's a lot of stats that, I mean, who ever put much into speed? Who ever put much into physical beauty when whatever the stat for interaction was? You can be ugly and still be extremely charismatic. In D&D, especially 5th edition D&D, they've pretty much balanced. Dex is still a little bit strong if you're using a finesse weapon, but you don't have to have Dex. Now, if you're picking up that big old greatsword and you're going to be wearing heavy armor, you don't need anything better than a 10. Or heck, even a 9. Well, see, the D&D monopoly is a 21st century thing. After 1980. Yes, D&D is the most famous, but I've been gaming since 1981. I didn't start with D&D. I started with a game by Steve Jackson Games called Car Wars, which, if you've ever heard of the game Gaslands, it's very similar to Gaslands, but it was done with paper tokens, and you had these strips of paper with road printed on them. And it was more of a war game than it was a role play, but it did have role play rules. You are welcome, Tobias. Don't forget, I do have that Discord. Feel free to ask questions in that Discord. That's part of why it's there. My goal is for people to be able to make their own sculpts. I want to see people making whatever the heck they want to make, because the more creativity, the better. Yeah, Car Wars was how I started. Then I got to D&D. But a lot of people don't know this, unless you played it, but first edition D&D, or first edition AD&D, Dungeon Master's Guide, included conversion rules from Boot Hill and Gamma World. Boot Hill being a cowboy role-playing game. Gamma World got a recent reboot, and it's basically After the Bomb. Yep. But yeah, I mean, in the 80s alone, you had Traveler, you had Star Frontier, you had, Boot Hill and Gamma World, you had Top Secret, you had Rollmaster, you had Tunnels and Trolls, you had Champions and Villains and Vigilantes, superhero games, and then later on in the decade, the DC and Marvel superhero games, both of which were accent thing. Since, from the time of its beginning until the early 80s or so, yeah, it had a monopoly almost. But from the mid-80s or so on through the early 21st century, oh no. In fact, right around 2000, it was almost a white wolf monopoly. Until D&D came out with 3rd edition /3.5. And then they came up with 4th edition, and gaming and role-playing games in general kind of started to dip. And then 5th edition. Ugh. Pathfinder's doing pretty darn well, but it's the same people. They're not gaining people the way that D&D is. Written. And a lot of them were designed to be insta-kill games, where when you started your game, you wrote up 6 characters. Because your character was going to die. You bring in another character. But with 5th edition, it's skyrocketing. But yeah, it's also, you can also look at it. Back in the day, most games took their cues from D&D. And the games that took the most risks were games that effectively were completely different genre. For example, both the Marvel and the DC superhero games in the 80s, the Mayfair DC and the TSR Marvel, were absolutely and completely unlike AD&D. They used charts instead of dice roll. They used, let's take the Marvel. It's easier to explain. You had 7 stats: fighting, agility, strength, endurance, intelligence, perception, and willpower. Or face rip. Fighting being your skill in melee. And you had ranks. You didn't have numbers, you had ranks. Yes, there was a number associated, ranging from 2 to 100, or more if you were cosmic. But it was feeble. Well, let's start down it. Feeble, poor, typical. The average human had typical in everything. Good, excellent, remarkable, incredible, amazing, monstrous, and unearthly. Using various characters as examples, the end result for absolute peak human was amazing fighting, incredible agility, excellent strength, remarkable endurance, amazing intelligence, incredible perception, amazing willpower. Yeah, it was kind of erratic. But what you did was you simply said, okay, my stat is amazing, and I want to try to succeed at this roll. I roll percentage and look down here, cross-section, amazing. Is it white? I failed. Green? I succeeded. Yellow? I succeeded well. Red? Crit. Very simple. It was also very quick to roll up a character. It was extremely random, and it's entirely possible that your party could be comprised of somebody roughly equivalent to Aunt May and somebody roughly equivalent to Thor in the same party. That doesn't work well. Game masters usually tweak the character generation. I have never played 10 Candles. Omerta, that might be a local thing. Here in Memphis, I'm seeing more of the opposite. I'm seeing Pathfinder players bleeding into 5th edition. Especially with the release of 2nd edition Pathfinder, which a lot of people hated. I know, don't rest your head. For a while there was All Flesh Must Be Eaten was really popular. To the point where they actually used it as the base for the Buffy the Vampire official role-playing game, which may as well have been just simply a world book for All Flesh Must Be Eaten. Oh. And then there's those games that in the 80s had their own system, but in the 21st century were using D20. Call of Cthulhu. Star Wars. Both of them in the 80s had their own system. In the 21st century, they were D20. Oh God, no, not Bessem D20. Bessem was fun, but it and the White Wolf superhero game Aberrant both had the same problem. At higher power levels, if you didn't have any kind of super defense power, you were dead in the first hit. No save, no way to resist. nothing. If you were hit, you were gone. You were red mist in the wind. And the best in D20, I never saw any successful games of that start past the first night. A perfect example. We tried to use Aberrant to create the Justice League in our games, or an equivalent of the Justice League. We just, we took aspects of the setting that we didn't like and went bye-bye. Like the whole fact that in 100 years, Aberrant would become Trinity because everyone who was getting these quantum powers was mutating into an eldritch abomination. No. So I created a character who was the Batman of the group. He did have some superpowers, but he swore up and down that he didn't. He was just a normal man with extreme training. And then we had the Superman and all that. Well, we got about halfway through the campaign, and then one of the fights, I got hit. And we looked at how much damage it did. Subtracted what armor I had, which was the Neofiber suit, whatever it was called. And I still took double my number of health levels damage, with no way to resist it. Period. I couldn't roll anything. And I ceased to exist. Anyway. There's a White Wolf game I used to play all the time with some of my fellow Marines. Mostly because it didn't require much role-playing. The White Wolf Street Fighter game. Street Fighter. If you remember the Big Bad Book of Beating Ass, that was inspired by Street Fighter, the role-playing game. But yeah, Street Fighter, the role-playing game, is, if it had been done well and not as a standard White Wolf game, if it had been done more as, well, almost something akin to HeroClix, actually, would probably be the best option for a Street Fighter style game, or Mortal Kombat, or something like that. That it could have been something. Like I said, I really could see it being done well in a HeroClix style thing. Like when you get up, if you've got like 7 points you can take, when you get up to 4 and 5, you have an ultimate you can suddenly do. Favorite game system beyond D&D? I would probably say that's, in fact, my favorite game system, period, is the old DC Heroes system. It was later bought by a company called Pulsar Games, who produced what they called Blood of Heroes, and then Blood of Heroes Special Edition. And then they got sued because even though they had removed every single reference to DC Comics, DC claimed that they had the rights to the system as well as to every other aspect of the game. That Mayfair had no right to sell it, and therefore it became a total legal mess. And the Pulsar Games had absolutely no way of fighting any of it. But it's a system that is, well, it is geared towards mid-power. It gets a little grainy at street level, and not grainy enough at the epic scale. But for the power level of, let's say, the mid-tier Avengers and Fantastic Four, not quite Superman and that, but for the mid-tiers, it's great. And it's incredibly versatile. There's a site called, what is it called? Writeups.org. That consists of literally almost 6,000 write-ups of characters from fiction and movies and everything for that game system. I mean, if you wanted to see what would happen if, let's say, the Thing from Fantastic Four in circa the 1980s fought, let's say, just picking, you wanted to see how Inuyasha would face against the Living Eraser. You can find out. If you want to see how the comic book version of Gamera would stand against Captain Thug from Titans Scissor Paper Stone, or, that kind of thing. It's just, that's how you do it. If you had to say fantasy, then besides D&D, I really liked the 7th Sea / Omerta, I Hope Forever. Fortnite is on the verge of doing this. Fortnite is one of those, hey, look at this games. Just trust me on that. Anyway, if you want fantasy, the 7th Sea / Legend of Five Rings system was really nice. One thing I liked about the 7th Sea was it had a mechanic that later would actually show up in 4th edition D&D, and that was the Mook Lieutenant Boss mechanic. You know what I'm talking about, Andy. A Mook, if you hit it, doesn't matter if you do any damage, they're down. Or, yeah, if you do, if you hit, and as long as you would have done damage, they're down. A lieutenant has roughly half the number of health levels of a player, and they're like the mini boss. And the boss has just as many health levels as an equivalent player. So the end result is your speedster can be over there just wailing through all of these mooks, while your heavy hitter is duking it out with the boss, and so on and so forth. Had an interesting approach to the magic system, where each country had a different style of magic. But I didn't like the fact that it's been revealed that every use of magic except for the shape-shifting of the Asurans and the legend magic from the Irish, whatever they were called, were actually weakening the seal of the great old ones, especially the fate magic that was tearing holes in that seal until eventually... That's one thing I didn't like about the campaign setting. See, I never played 2nd edition. I've only ever played the 1st edition of both. Now, going back to White Wolf, World of Darkness, I actually like the original Changeling best of all because I don't like playing bad guys. And Changeling was about the only game system that had any kind of hope. That had any kind of thing where your characters are unequivocally trying to do good for the world. Yes, it's for selfish reasons, but by increasing the creativity and imagination and drive of humans, you get strength. Okay, that's better than tearing them down and destroying them. I mean, in Mage you're trying to help the world, but you're up against such unimaginable odds that 99% of the games turn into instead of being a psychic debate on what laws of reality should be, into, oh crap, we're being hunted by the Terminators again. Oh. And then they went and turned Changeling into even the most bizarre and hopeless game in the new world of darkness. Mm-hmm. I have been asked that if my friend Adam is ever in town during one of our local cons, he's currently living in the Philippines as the manager of a call center, that we not play in the Vampire LARP at the con. Just because we took over Portugal that one time. So many people playing Vampire never actually read anything. They just see things like, oh look, a Malkavian's crazy. That means they're Looney Tunes. No, I'm a Malkavian. I'm crazy. No, that's not what it means. Alright, scenario. 1491, Portugal. Lisbon. The prince has been assassinated, and there is a justiciar on his way. Well, my friend Adam and I, and Adam's girlfriend, Vicky, played the only 3 Sabbat characters in that session. The actual assassin was long gone. Well, he was Tremere Antitribute, Ventru Antitribute, and Vicky and I were Malkavian Antitribute. We didn't choose these characters. They were just what was left. Without lying one single time, Adam managed to convince them all that he was the Justiciar, who, by the way, wasn't scheduled in the game to show up until the end of the session. Meanwhile, my character, the Malkavian, his flaw, his mental issue was, under high-stress situations, he started telling the story of his embrace. That was it. Vicky's character thought she was a nun. That was it. And you know what? It's amazing how people tend to talk about their plans freely around always just a crazy Malkavian. Just by us walking around and just playing up the whole fishwalk cliche, they just ignored us and went about their business as usual. And then we'd go back and report to Adam. By the time it was all said and done, we had managed to convince the Bruja and the local Ventru and Tremere to turn anti-tribute and to call a blood hunt on the Gangrel and the etc., and taking control over Lisbon, Portugal, and through it the rest of Portugal. So they've asked us not to ever team up again as the local cons, because when 3 people managed to so completely dominate the political situation of the game by taking advantage of preconceived notions, etc., yeah. I'm also no longer allowed to overthrow the government of the biggest city in the campaign world on the first night of gameplay at 3rd level, playing a trickster priest, which I'm also no longer allowed to do in that one gaming group. Anyway, it is 9:45. I have about another 2.5 hours before the replacement base is finished. Yay. There we go. We never had ship combat in my campaign, in the game I was in, so I'm not sure how it works, in all honesty. I will say that it's probably a lot more abstract than in a game like Man of War. It wasn't just social engineering, Mark. It was that all of these people, it was like 80% of the people that were playing in the LARP were in the official Memphis by Night vampire LARP that was actually sponsored by White Wolf. They knew each other. They knew each other's that. I look at ship-to-ship combat and large-scale combat. There's really 3 ways to handle it. Well, actually 4. Number 4, the worst way, in my opinion, is to roll every single attack and damage roll. To have, you've got 200 orcs coming, roll every single one of their arrow shots. No. The second is to use a game system that's designed for it, for ship-to-ship combat. Okay. I'm back. Okay, so, tabletop, use something like the D&D battle system. Then there's the abstract. You have already planned ahead on who's going to win and who's going to lose. And that unless the players do something incredibly stupid or incredibly heroic, it's not going to change the outcome. And then finally, there's the results of the battle as a whole reflect the success or failure of the characters and their portion. And this can be done flip-flop. For example, if the players are doing very, very well, the rest of the army might be forced to fall back. And the characters become even more heroic. Whereas if the characters aren't doing so well, then the rest of the army starts doing better so they can get a little bit of assistance to take the heat off. In that second respect, you really want to have predetermined who's going to win the battle. In the first one, where it's, the player character's success or failure determines the tide of battle, that's entirely on them. Those are the 4 primary ways to handle a mass combat or naval combat situation that I'm aware of, unless the game has explicit rules. Excuse me. For example, I was in a game one time where the overall end result of a mass battle was handled by a single roll of the dice per general, based on their skill, modifiers from like scenario, like if you're outnumbered 2-1, you got a penalty. If you've got higher morale, you got a bonus. If you're in a fortress, you've got a bonus, that kind of thing. I have not seen Matt Colville's mass combat rules. But for the most part, mass combat is abstract from the point of view of the individual trooper. Your player characters are individuals. I think it's best handled in the abstract. Or like, let's say they're on board a ship and they're sailing. You roll an encounter and it's a pirate ship. Well, a couple of the pirates either teleport over by the pirate mage, or the players teleport over the pirate ship. The success or failure of the ship-to-ship combat will be based on a success or failure in players against the pirates. Also, in a world with no gunpowder, magic will be used to replace gunpowder. You will have ship mages that replace the cannons. You know, fire bolt, fire bolt, fire bolt, fire bolt, fireball, fire bolt, fireball. Whatever. Slayers, an anime from the 90s, had an episode where a naval battle was a whole lot of white-robed people walked up to one side of the ship. Fireball, fireball, fireball. Light or heavy magic in games depends on the campaign and the system. Light magic in D&D tends to be balanced around a mid to high power magic level, whereas a game like Warhammer is based around low magic, but when it does get used, it's high power. Which that's more of a Conan style of the magic. In Conan, sorcerers didn't cast a lot of spells constantly flinging around like D&D. But when they did do something, it was like a meteor pulled from the heavens that destroys an entire fortress, reaching through the veil to bring forth an elder god. That sort of thing. But yeah, so I would determine, if I wanted to play something like magic, I'd choose a system that was innately light magic. And wasn't one of the role-playing versions, or one of the Rollmaster versions. If I wanted to play something heavy magic, I'd choose a system that's based on heavy magic, built around it. 3.5 especially was heavy magic. If you didn't have a lot of magic items, you weren't going to survive, because the difficulties were based on the idea that by 10th level you had a +3. That kind of thing. But sometimes I like high magic, sometimes I like low magic, sometimes no magic. And yes, there's game systems out there for that. And sometimes I like everybody can hurl fireballs. Superheroes. Easy thing to try and model as a first time. Do you mean creature or prop? I'll be honest, one of the easiest things I've sculpted recently has been the standing stones. I mean, let me go ahead and... The big rock he's carrying. It's not a simple rectangle. It has that chipped away rock look. But, you know. Okay, creature. Your best bet is going to be something serpentine. Simply because it's a tube. And you only really have to sculpt one end and give the rest of it a pattern. You could make it like a death serpent with a skull head, and then just a snake body. Something with this weird multiple talons coming up from around the head and down the front of the body, and then snake the rest. One of the hardest things to do is a realistic, real-world animal. I showed this earlier. This is one of the things that's coming with Argus, is his dire Cape Buffalo. That Cape Buffalo was harder for me to sculpt than Argus was. And that's with multiple references to work from. This guy right here. Yeah. So, Oh yeah, down there on the far left is a human for scale. But yeah, the problem with natural, real world animals is that people just glancing at them can see what the problems are. Like, if your cat, if your sculpt of a cat doesn't look like a cat, everyone can tell, and they can tell why. Well, cats' ears are pointed. Their legs don't bend like that, etc., etc. So, actually, it might even be that Eldritch Abominations would be one of the easiest things to make, just simply because you make a blob, make a whole lot of tentacles coming around. It might be difficult to print, but or just like a maw, an open inverted cone with teeth all over it, and then coming out from this thing of wings, and then two little tentacles with eyeballs. Okay. I'm sure most of you have seen these around Thingiverse. These whole purpose is that you take your figure and you kind of pop it in there, and that's your figure riding a horse. Well, I am planning on something that will... I've used this. Yes, it's a headless Citadel horse that I haven't even really glued together. As basically just to measure the size in comparison. And as you can see, the Citadel horse is a little small. That's about pony sized. Oh no, that's about right. That's about the right size for a horse for a human. So I have the option here of either making the rider and horses one, or making a rider that can fit on the standard Citadel horses. I probably won't do that. I'll probably make the rider and horse myself. My thought was, say, each figure would have the starting figure, the middle figure, not middle finger, starting figure, middle figure, and advanced figure. For example, for a barbarian, starting figure, he's wearing a loincloth with a longsword. Middle figure, he's got pauldrons, his loincloth is heavier, he's got thicker boots, and he's got bracers, and he's got a larger, more ornate sword. Advanced figure, he's got, big old pauldrons, fur, a disc of metal on his belly, big old spike knee cops, maybe a spectacled helm, and a great sword with spikes and stuff. The problem with making the figure rideable or not is that if he's not on the horse, he'll be bow-legged. He won't look right. You'd have to do what Ralpartha actually did this back in the day. It was Ralpartha or Ratham? I think it was Ralpartha. They gave a given miniature a version on foot and a version on horseback. The same figure, the same upper torso, with just the different legs. But now imagine you combine the two so that there's eventually 6 figures for one character. Low tier on foot and on horse, middle tier on foot and on horse, and top tier on foot and on horse. And the horse would go from having just bridle and saddle, having a little bit of armor, being fully and heavily caparisoned and chamfroned. That sort of thing. Beak. Beak. She decided that her bed was going to be here, by the way. Yeah. Well, back in 2003 through 2004. How does my hand taste? Back in 2003 to 2005, we had roommates. They left. And so I decided to move some of my stuff into here to be my office, like the bookcases and that. Well, I had my laundry right here from when I first moved in. And she started sleeping on the laundry. Well, we ended up moving the laundry after just a few days. She sat right where the laundry had been and cried. And cried. I brought the laundry back in just to find out. She hopped on and just curled up and went right to sleep. So we went out to Walmart, got a couple of these 3-drawer filing cabinet things, and put 2 of them right here with a little pillow on top of them. And a towel as a washable surface for her, and yeah. I'm actually kind of surprised Carlton hasn't come back in here. Anyway. But yeah, she's about to turn 13, and yet she's still faster. I've seen her go, easily go from the top of that bookcase to the top of that from a standing start without even blinking. And she gets there from here. She jumps from there to there in one jump. There's over way up the other side of the room, literally 7 feet away, there's a box. She will jump from the box to her bed in one jump. From a standing start, 7 feet, at 13. She's not slowing down. Her name is Shinju. That's Japanese for pearl. Shinju. Sierra, Hotel, India, November, Juliet, uniform. Meanwhile, I'm thinking about replacing this little thing down here. The little symbol. Because I no longer, number one, I no longer play that character. And number two, it's that's one that was made that could not be redistributed, so Pokey. One thing about this cat, I can pet her belly. No one else can. Anyway, it is 10:02. I'm going to go ahead and call it. It's already starting to have problems with YouTube going. And then in my mouth, if you know what I mean. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to refresh this page. And then I'm going to hold up my hand, and I'm going to start doing my countdown. When I get to 1, I'm going to say something completely and utterly goofy, and then sign on out of here. So that's a 5, a 4, a 3, a 2, and a 1. Something completely goofy. Merry Christmas.